Martin, the butcher Hayes, Aisha Silent Shadow Khan, and Liam the accountant Doyle. Three ruthless figures who ruled Britain's most dangerous gang network with an iron fist, unseen and untouchable for years. Their empire thrived in the shadows, built on fear, betrayal, and cold calculation. But when a single violent attack shattered their fragile alliance, everything they fought for began to unravel, revealing secrets that would shake the very foundations of the UK's criminal underworld. In the late 1990s, the criminal underworld in the UK was changing. Small street gangs, once isolated and territorial, began to connect with one another in ways never seen before. Out of this shift emerged a new kind of power, organized, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. This was the beginning of what would later be known as the Bosses of Blighty. Unlike the typical gang leaders who ruled by brute force alone, these figures operated with a mix of cold intelligence and ruthless strategy, building an empire that stretched across cities and regions. The rise of this network wasn't sudden. It started quietly, with a handful of ambitious criminals recognizing that working together could multiply their influence and profits. They formed secret alliances, trading resources and information while eliminating rivals who threatened their plans. These early partnerships were fragile, held together by fear and the promise of wealth. But over time, they evolved into a structured syndicate with a strict hierarchy and clear rules. No one outside the group knew the full extent of their reach, and even police officers who tried to investigate often found themselves hitting dead ends. What made this network unique was its ability to remain invisible. The bosses rarely appeared in public or communicated directly with the people running day-to-day operations. Instead, they worked through layers of trusted lieutenants and enforcers who carried out their orders with brutal precision. These middlemen were fiercely loyal, knowing that betrayal meant death or worse. Their influence stretched beyond just drugs and weapons. They controlled money laundering rings, illegal gambling, and even infiltrated legitimate businesses to hide their profits. This diversity made them harder to trace and gave them a financial base strong enough to bribe officials or silence witnesses when needed. The bosses ruled, not just through fear but through a sense of order. They imposed rules on how territories were managed and how disputes were settled. This iron grip prevented open warfare between factions, keeping their empire stable, yet beneath this surface of control lay a growing tension. Rivalries simmered, and ambition threatened to disrupt the fragile balance. The bosses knew that their power depended on secrecy and unity, but trust was a scarce commodity in their world. As the new millennium approached, the stage was set for this hidden empire to grow even larger. The Bosses of Blighty operated from the shadows, their names unknown to most, but their influence shaping the darkest corners of British society. Their story was only just beginning, and what followed would reveal a world of danger, betrayal and deadly ambition, unlike anything seen before. By the early 2000s, the syndicate known as the Bosses of Blighty had expanded far beyond its humble beginnings. What started as a loose alliance of criminals had transformed into a sprawling network that touched nearly every major city in the United Kingdom. From the busy streets of London to the industrial landscapes of Manchester, from the docks of Liverpool to the gritty neighborhoods of Glasgow, their influence was everywhere. This expansion was no accident, but the result of careful planning and ruthless efficiency. Each city was controlled by one of the gang lords, carefully chosen for their ability to maintain order and maximize profits. These leaders operated like regional managers, overseeing the distribution of drugs, weapons, and other illegal goods in their territories. But unlike typical street gangs that fought openly for control, these bosses were part of a larger secret council that met rarely and in secret. This shadowy group coordinated the syndicate's overall strategy, settling disputes and dividing profits to keep the fragile peace intact. This structure gave the bosses a huge advantage. They could move goods quickly and discreetly across city lines, avoiding the kind of turf wars that often brought unwanted police attention. They shared intelligence, warned each other of law enforcement operations, and helped each other eliminate threats, whether rival gangs or untrustworthy members. Their network was like a well-oiled machine, operating in the shadows with deadly precision. The bosses also diversified their criminal activities. While drug trafficking remained the core business, they moved into money laundering, human trafficking, and illegal gambling to increase their wealth and influence. They invested in legitimate businesses as fronts, from nightclubs to construction companies, using these to hide their profits and gain social legitimacy. This made it much harder for police to trace the money or build solid cases against them. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. The bosses' use of encrypted communication, insider information, and sophisticated counter-surveillance made investigations difficult. Corruption within police ranks sometimes slowed efforts further, as bribes and intimidation kept some officers from pursuing cases aggressively. Despite occasional arrests and seizures, the syndicate remained largely untouchable. This vast and organized network allowed the bosses to rule their territories with a mix of fear and respect. Residents knew the bosses controlled everything from street crime to local businesses, and crossing them often meant violent consequences. But beneath the surface, tension was building. With so many powerful men sharing control, rivalries were inevitable. The bosses had built an empire, but keeping it together was a dangerous balancing act. The slightest misstep could trigger chaos. Although the true identities of the bosses remained mostly hidden from the public, by the mid-2000s, the media and law enforcement had begun to piece together who some of these key figures were. Their stories revealed a chilling mix of backgrounds, showing that ruthlessness and ambition could come from almost anywhere. One of the most notorious was a former boxer from Birmingham, whose violent past made him both feared and respected. He had transitioned from fighting in the ring to fighting for control of the city's drug trade, quickly rising through the ranks by using brutality and intimidation to eliminate his rivals. In Liverpool, a different kind of leader emerged, a cold, calculating enforcer, who commanded loyalty through a combination of fear and strategic violence. Unlike the boxer, he wasn't known for physical strength, but for his ability to plan hits and coordinate attacks that left rivals shattered and confused. His reputation was built on silence and efficiency. Under his control, Liverpool's criminal underworld became tightly organized, with a clear chain of command that discouraged betrayal. Further north, in Newcastle, a quieter but equally dangerous mastermind controlled the financial side of the syndicate. Unlike the others, he stayed out of the spotlight, working behind the scenes to manage money laundering operations, offshore accounts, and secret investments. His expertise in finance allowed the gang network to move millions of pounds undetected, funding everything from weapons purchases to bribing officials. His cold logic and attention to detail made him indispensable to the entire operation. Together, these men formed the backbone of the Bosses of Blighty. Though separated by geography, they shared a ruthless mindset and an unyielding desire for control. They weren't just criminals. They were leaders who understood the importance of discipline and strategy. Their power depended on their ability to command respect, not only through fear but through demonstrating they were the ultimate authority in their territories. Their leadership style was clear. Any threat to their power was met with swift and often brutal punishment. Disloyalty was never tolerated, and rivals were eliminated without hesitation. This zero-tolerance policy kept the syndicate relatively stable, despite the dangerous personalities involved. By the time their names began appearing in news reports and police files, the Bosses of Blighty were no longer just whispers in the dark. They were the most powerful gang lords in the UK, ruling with an iron fist and shaping the criminal landscape for years to come. Their empire was built on fear, cunning, and an unbreakable code of silence. Despite their seemingly unshakable control, cracks began to appear in the empire of the Bosses of Blighty as the new decade progressed. The syndicate's power relied heavily on the delicate balance between cooperation and fear, but this balance was increasingly threatened by a rising force from outside the established order. A younger, ambitious criminal began challenging the old boss's authority, using new tactics and modern technology to gain influence quickly. Unlike the traditional leaders who ruled through intimidation and old-school connections, This newcomer relied on speed, innovation, and a network of younger operatives who were more willing to break the old rules. This new rival didn't just want a small piece of the territory, he aimed to take control of the entire network. His methods were disruptive, targeting the supply chains and communication lines that the bosses had relied on for years. These attacks were more than just physical, they were psychological, designed to unsettle the established leaders and force them into mistakes. His rise created unrest within the ranks, as some younger members saw an opportunity to break free from the old guard, while loyalists feared losing their hard-won power. At the same time, competition between the bosses, once carefully managed by their shadow council, began to grow more intense. Long-standing grudges and old rivalries resurfaced, fueled by mistrust and suspicion. The bosses had always maintained a fragile peace through shared interests and mutual threats, but the newcomers' challenge exposed the weaknesses in their alliances. Secret meetings became tense. Agreements were broken, and smaller disputes escalated quickly into violent confrontations. Violence spilled onto the streets in ways that hadn't been seen before. Skirmishes between factions left neighborhoods on edge, with innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The previously unseen tensions became public knowledge as news reports began covering the rising violence. For the first time in years, the syndicate's grip seemed less certain. Yet behind the scenes, the bosses remained ruthless. They tightened their security and doubled down on intelligence gathering, trying to root out the new rival and any traitors who might support him. They used their network to spread misinformation, hoping to confuse and divide their enemies, but the newcomer was cunning, adapting quickly and always staying one step ahead. This period marked a turning point. The empire that once appeared invincible was showing signs of vulnerability. Ambition, betrayal, and shifting loyalties threatened to unravel the syndicate from within. What had been a tightly controlled criminal empire was now a battlefield where every move could mean life or death. The stakes were higher than ever, and the bosses knew that survival would require more than just fear. It would demand cunning, strategy, and sometimes brutal sacrifice. Everything changed on a cold autumn night that would become known as one of the bloodiest and most shocking events in the history of the Bosses of Blighty. In Manchester, one of the syndicate's key safe houses, a heavily guarded building used for meetings and storing valuable assets, was attacked with brutal precision. The assault was swift and unexpected, catching the leaders and their trusted lieutenants off guard. Armed men, heavily equipped and highly organized, stormed the safe house. They moved through the building with chilling efficiency, leaving no one alive who could stand in their way. Several high-ranking members of the syndicate were killed, including some who had been central to maintaining peace between rival factions. The violence was ruthless, intended not just to eliminate enemies but to send a clear message. The attack was meant to tear the network apart, striking at its very core. The shockwaves from the assault spread quickly. The syndicate, known for its careful planning and control, was subtly vulnerable. Rumors swirled about who was behind the attack. Some believed it was the work of the rising rival who had been challenging the old bosses for years, trying to weaken them before taking full control. Others suspected that a rival gang outside the network saw an opportunity to strike while the bosses were distracted by internal conflicts. But the most disturbing possibility was betrayal from within. In a criminal world ruled by loyalty and fear, the idea that one of their own could have allowed or even helped plan the attack was terrifying. Trust, already fragile from years of tension, shattered completely. Paranoia took hold, and leaders began turning on each other, fearing their own allies might be plotting against them. Law enforcement agencies seized the moment, launching investigations and intensifying surveillance. Yet, despite the violence and chaos, the bosses themselves remained elusive, disappearing into the shadows to avoid capture or retaliation. The attack exposed the cracks in the syndicate's armor but did not destroy it, at least not yet. Instead, it set off a deadly chain of events that would change the course of the gang network forever. Suspicion, revenge, and fear spread through the ranks, pushing the bosses into a desperate fight to hold on to power. The Night of Blood marked the beginning of the end for the syndicate as it was known, but it also revealed deeper secrets hidden within the gang's core. Secrets that would shock everyone who thought they understood the true nature of the Bosses of Blighty. In the chaotic aftermath of the brutal attack, investigations uncovered something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Amid the violence and suspicion, hidden deep within the syndicate's operations was a secret that threatened to destroy the entire network from within. Police raids and covert surveillance uncovered encrypted documents, secret ledgers and hidden messages that revealed a level of betrayal no one had expected. These secret records detailed illegal deals, off-the-books payments, and financial transactions that implicated someone high up in the syndicate in collaboration with law enforcement. The existence of a mole, a traitor working against the gang, shattered the fragile trust that had held the bosses together for years. This wasn't just a leak of information, it was a systematic betrayal that compromised the gang's operations and endangered everyone involved. The revelation sent shockwaves through the syndicate. The bosses had always ruled through fear and loyalty, but now they faced the terrifying possibility that one of their own had been feeding information to the police. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Meetings that once focused on business and strategy turned into tense interrogations and accusations. Every member became a suspect, and no one was safe from suspicion. The mole's identity remained a closely guarded secret, hidden behind layers of deception. This person had managed to stay undercover by playing both sides expertly, feeding false information to the gang, while providing law enforcement with critical leads. This double game allowed law enforcement to plan raids and arrests that weakened the syndicate, but the mole also manipulated events to keep suspicion away from themselves. Within the gang, the betrayal caused fractures that rivaled the violence on the streets. Some bosses sought to root out the traitor by any means necessary, unleashing violence against suspected members. Others feared that exposing the mole too quickly might cause even greater chaos or lead to a total collapse. The uncertainty tore apart alliances, and the syndicate's once tightly controlled structure began to crumble. This secret betrayal marked a turning point in the story of the Bosses of Blighty. What had seemed like a powerful and unified criminal empire was, in reality, vulnerable to internal collapse. The mole's actions not only exposed the gang to law enforcement, but also ignited a chain reaction of mistrust and violence that would change the criminal landscape forever. Behind the ruthless facade of power, a hidden truth was unraveling, one that would shock everyone who thought they knew the gang's story. The discovery of a mole within the Bosses of Blighty set off a desperate and ruthless hunt that would shake the syndicate to its core. Paranoia gripped the leadership as they scrambled to identify the traitor who had betrayed them to law enforcement. No one could be trusted, and every ally became a potential enemy. The hunt was not just about survival, it was about protecting power and preventing the empire from collapsing. Each boss launched their own investigations, using their network of informants, enforcers and spies to root out the mole. These efforts were marked by brutal interrogation methods, kidnappings, and even killings of suspected members. Innocent men were often caught in the crossfire, victims of suspicion and fear rather than actual guilt. The syndicate's once clear lines of loyalty blurred as old friendships were broken and former allies turned against one another. Meanwhile, the mole continued to play a dangerous and clever game. Feeding false information to both the gang and the police, the traitor manipulated the chaos to their advantage. This deception caused confusion and mistrust, delaying the syndicate's ability to act decisively. The mole's skillful manipulation made it impossible to tell friend from foe, and the syndicate's leaders found themselves constantly one step behind. Internal power struggles intensified as the hunt progressed. Ambitious members saw the turmoil as an opportunity to challenge existing leaders and grab more control. Factions formed, each pushing their own agenda and making alliances that shifted rapidly. What had been a tightly controlled network was now fractured into competing groups, each wary of betrayal and attack. As the syndicate's structure weakened, the violence escalated. Street battles, assassinations, and retaliatory attacks increased in frequency and severity. The public began to notice the spike in crime, and law enforcement redoubled efforts to capitalize on the disorder. The bosses, once untouchable, were now vulnerable as the syndicate tore itself apart from within. Despite the chaos, some leaders remained determined to keep the syndicate alive. They tightened security, changed communication methods, and tried to rebuild trust where possible. But the damage was deep. The mole's betrayal had unleashed a chain reaction that threatened not only the gang's survival but also the future of organized crime in the UK. In the midst of this turmoil, the question remained: who was the mole? The answer held the key to whether the Bosses of Blighty would survive or fall. But uncovering the truth was proving more dangerous and complicated than anyone had imagined. As the syndicate descended further into chaos, law enforcement saw an opportunity they had long awaited. For years, police forces across the UK had struggled to dismantle the Bosses of Blighty, frustrated by the gang's secrecy, sophisticated operations, and deep-rooted corruption. But now, with the network weakened by internal betrayal and violent infighting, the authorities launched coordinated raids across multiple cities in an unprecedented crackdown. Specialized units moved swiftly, targeting safe houses, warehouses, and front businesses linked to the syndicate. The raids were carefully planned using intelligence gathered from surveillance, informants, and the invaluable information leaked by the mole. Dozens of gang members were arrested, key supply routes were cut off, and large quantities of drugs and weapons were seized. The arrests sent shockwaves through the underworld, signaling that the bosses were no longer untouchable. Despite these successes, the syndicate's top leaders remained elusive. The bosses anticipated the raids and used their resources to disappear into safe locations, protected by loyalists and advanced security measures. Their ability to vanish into the shadows frustrated police efforts and kept the heart of the criminal empire intact. For now, the arrests, however, caused significant disruption. With many mid-level operatives behind bars or under surveillance, communication and coordination within the syndicate became difficult. The power vacuum led to more violent clashes as smaller factions fought to claim abandoned territories and resources. This infighting further weakened the syndicate, making it easier for law enforcement to target fragmented groups rather than a united front. Public confidence in the police grew as news of the raids and arrests spread, offering hope that the gang's reign might be coming to an end. However, experts warned that removing key members did not guarantee the collapse of such a deeply embedded network. The bosses' ability to adapt and rebuild was well known, and the system they had built was designed to survive shocks like this. Behind the scenes, the bosses regrouped quietly. They restructured their operations, recruited new members, and developed new methods to avoid detection. Their disappearance did not signal defeat, but rather a strategic retreat to preserve what remained of their power. The crackdown marked a turning point. The syndicate was no longer the untouchable force it had once been, but the war for control was far from over. The Bosses of Blighty had been weakened, but they were not yet defeated. The battle between law enforcement and the gang lords was entering a new, uncertain phase, one where survival depended on cunning, loyalty, and the ability to strike back from the shadows. In the shadowy aftermath of the police crackdown, the fragile syndicate faced a new and unexpected threat from within. The power vacuum left by arrests and betrayals ignited fierce struggles among the remaining bosses and their lieutenants. What had once been a coordinated empire fractured into competing factions, each desperate to claim what was left of the gang's territory and influence. This internal war was far more dangerous than any external attack, because it wasn't just about resources, it was a fight for survival and legacy. The violence between rival groups escalated dramatically, with shootings and ambushes becoming more frequent on the streets. These conflicts didn't just impact the gang members, innocent civilians often found themselves caught in the crossfire. The public outcry grew louder, forcing authorities to increase their presence in affected neighborhoods. But the fragmented gangs continued to operate in the shadows, adapting to the increased pressure. Behind the scenes, old alliances shattered, and former friends became enemies overnight. Trust, which had been a fragile thread throughout the syndicate's existence, was now nearly impossible to find. Leaders who once cooperated for mutual benefit began plotting against each other, using informants, sabotage, and assassination attempts to weaken rivals. This bitter infighting accelerated the syndicate's decline. Amid this turmoil, a shocking revelation further complicated the power struggle. Evidence surfaced, revealing that one of the founding bosses had secretly been working with the police for years, providing information in exchange for immunity and protection. This betrayal shocked even hardened criminals, shaking the very foundation of the syndicate's code of silence. The exposed boss fled, leaving a trail of uncertainty and fear behind. This revelation deepened the paranoia gripping the remaining leaders. Fearing they might be next, many went into hiding or increased their security measures. Some attempted to negotiate temporary truces to focus on survival rather than domination, but these agreements rarely lasted long. The constant threat of betrayal made any alliance fragile and short-lived. As the syndicate splintered, its influence waned. Rival gangs outside the network seized the opportunity to expand their own territories, further eroding the power the bosses once held. What began as a united criminal empire had turned into a fractured battlefield. The once mighty Bosses of Blighty were no longer the untouchable overlords of the UK's underworld. Their empire was crumbling, weakened by violence, betrayal and loss. But even in decline, the legacy of their ruthless rule left a lasting mark on Britain's criminal landscape. A warning that power, no matter how strong,